4 in the morning. The South China Sea, 200 miles east of the Paracel Islands. The USS Ronald Reagan was already at general quarters. Its flight deck, a hive of controlled chaos under the dim red glow of battle lights. This was not the routine freedom of navigation patrol the crew had practiced for months. It was the beginning of a high-stakes gamble to break a Chinese blockade that had effectively closed the region to international shipping. Whether the carrier air wing could dismantle a multi-layered surface fleet before the first wave of land-based ballistic missiles arrived remained the question that every officer on the bridge was silently calculating. The humid air was heavy with the scent of jet fuel and the sharp, metallic tang of the sea. Below the carrier, the dark water of the Pacific churned into a white wake that stretched for miles toward the horizon, reflecting the distant, flickering lightning of a tropical storm front. On the flag bridge of Carrier Strike Group 5, the tactical displays were crowded with orange icons. For 72 hours, the People's Liberation Army Navy had been tightening a noose around the Paracel archipelago. Intelligence reports indicated that the South Sea Fleet had deployed a vanguard of 4 Type 55 destroyers and 6 Type 52 Delta destroyers to act as a picket line. These vessels were the most advanced in the Chinese inventory, equipped with vertical launch systems capable of firing hundreds of anti-ship and surface-to-air missiles. They were positioned at coordinates 16 degrees, 30 minutes north, 112 degrees, 30 minutes east, creating a lethal no-go zone that extended 300 miles in every direction. The commanding officer of the USS Ronald Reagan stood near the central plotting table, his eyes fixed on the speed and heading of the Chinese formation. The enemy was moving at 28 knots, heading directly for the strike group's predicted intercept point. "The window is closing," the commander said, his voice level despite the weight of the moment. "If we do not suppress their air defenses now, we will be fighting their missiles instead of their ships by sunrise."
Bridge. Weapons status report.
Around him, the bridge crew worked with practiced efficiency, their hands moving over touchscreens and communication panels. The hum of the ship's nuclear reactors vibrated through the steel deck, a constant reminder of the immense power being harnessed to keep the 100,000-ton vessel moving at 30 knots into the wind. On the flight deck, the first 4 FA-18 fighters of the strike package were hooked into the steam catapults. The pilots sat in their cockpits, faces illuminated by the green glow of the heads-up displays, checking their weapon loadouts one last time. Each aircraft carried a pair of long-range anti-ship missiles and 2 AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles for self-defense. Behind them, the EA-18 Golf Growlers of the Electronic Attack Squadron taxied into position, their wings heavy with jamming pods designed to blind the Chinese AN/SPY-6 equivalent radars. The deck crew, dressed in color-coded jerseys, moved with the precision of a ballet, dodging the screaming intakes of jet engines as the catapult officers gave the final signals. With a thunderous crack that shook the entire hull, the first FA-18 fighter was hurled into the darkness. The jet's twin engines went into full afterburner, 2 long tongues of blue and yellow flame pushing the aircraft into the humid night air. Seconds later, the second, third, and fourth fighters followed, disappearing into the low clouds. The air above the carrier was instantly filled with the roar of departing engines, a sound that drowned out even the crashing of the waves against the bow. This was the first wave of a coordinated strike involving 48 aircraft from the carrier air wing, supported by the escorting destroyers of the strike group. The mission was clear: neutralize the outer defensive screen of the South Sea Fleet within the first 6 hours. Without the protection of their Aegis-class equivalents, the Chinese capital ships would be vulnerable to the heavy ordnance waiting in the carrier's magazines. But the Chinese were not passive observers. Even as the first U.S. aircraft crossed the 100-mile mark, the radar warning receivers in the cockpits began to chirp. The Chinese HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries on the Paracel Islands had just transitioned to active tracking. The electronic signature of a massive fleet was now screaming across the digital spectrum, and the first salvos of the 72-hour war were about to be fired. The silence of the South China Sea was gone, replaced by the invisible fingers of radar beams searching for a target to destroy. 5:30 in the morning. The edge of the Chinese exclusion zone, The first wave of F-35 Bravo stealth fighters from Carrier Strike Group 5 crossed the line of departure. These pilots were flying into a digital wall of radar and missile threats that no American aviator had faced in 80 years. The cockpit glass was cold against the humid tropical air outside, and below them, the sea was a vast, featureless black, broken only by the occasional white crest of a breaking wave. The mission had moved from theory to reality in the time it took for a single engine to cycle, and the survival of the 7th Fleet now rested on the next 60 minutes of air combat. The F-35 Bravo pilots maintained strict radio silence, their aircraft operating in a clean configuration to minimize their radar cross-section. In the helmet-mounted displays, the world was rendered in a neon green and gold wireframe, the fusion of data from dozens of sensors providing a godlike view of the battle space. At coordinates 16 degrees 20 minutes north, 113 degrees 45 minutes east. The lead pilot identified the electronic signature of a Type 55 destroyer. The ship was broadcasting at full power, its radar searching the sky for the very aircraft that were now closing to within 80 miles of its position. The pilot could see the individual pulses of the Chinese radar on his display, a rhythmic heartbeat of electronic energy that was desperately trying to find a solid return. 20 miles behind the stealth fighters, a second wave of 24 FA-18 Rhinos flew at 30,000 feet. Unlike the stealth jets, the Rhinos were highly visible on Chinese radar, acting as a deliberate distraction and a heavy-hitting follow-up force. Under their wings, they carried the long-range anti-ship missile, a weapon designed to think for itself as it navigated through complex enemy defenses. The air around the Rhinos was thick with the scent of ozone and the steady vibration of twin General Electric engines pushing the airframes through the thin atmosphere at 900 kilometers per hour. Every pilot in the formation knew they were the bait, drawing the enemy's attention, so the stealth aircraft could move in for the kill. Suddenly, the tactical data link erupted with warnings. The Chinese South Sea Fleet had seen the Rhinos. From the decks of the destroyers, 12 HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles erupted in a sequence of white-hot flashes. The missiles climbed vertically on pillars of smoke before pitching over toward the American formation, accelerating to 4 times the speed of sound. The Chinese had fired their first salvos from a range of 150 kilometers, a distance that tested the absolute limits of their engagement envelope. The sky above the South China Sea was suddenly scarred by 12 white streaks of exhaust, reaching out like fingers to claw the American jets. From the air, in the cockpits of the FA-18 fighters, the pilots watched the incoming threats on their tactical displays. Vampire. 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 The automated voice called out in their headsets, indicating incoming anti-air missiles. The American aircraft did not turn away. Instead, they accelerated, their own radars locking onto the incoming Chinese projectiles. The mission commanders on the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, flying 50 miles to the rear, coordinated the defense. They assigned specific targets to the escorting U.S. destroyers, which were now readying their Mark 41 vertical launch systems for a long-range intercept to protect the strike package. The Chinese strategy was to saturate the American strike package with long-range fire, forcing the jets to jettison their heavy anti-ship missiles to survive. But the American pilots remained disciplined, trusting in their electronic warfare suites and the stealthy scouts ahead of them. The F-35 Bravos, still undetected, moved into position to provide mid-course guidance for the missiles that would soon be launched from the Rhinos. The coordination between the stealth scouts and the heavy shooters was the cornerstone of the carrier air wings. Offensive plan, a symphony of data and metal that required perfect timing. As the first Chinese HQ-9 missiles crossed the 100-kilometer mark, the lead FA-18 pilot gave the order to release. Boxer lead. Weapons free. Pickle. One by one, the long-range anti-ship missiles dropped from the pylons. The heavy weapons fell for a fraction of a second before their turbojet engines ignited, sending them screaming toward the Chinese fleet at high subsonic speeds. 48 missiles were now in the air, skimming just 10 meters above the waves to hide in the radar clutter of the sea surface. The friction of the air against the missile skins raised their temperature to hundreds of degrees, but their low observable shapes kept them hidden from the enemies. Long-range eyes. The engagement had transitioned from a tense standoff to a massive exchange of kinetic energy. The sky between the two fleets was now a crisscross of white exhaust trails, each one representing a multi-million-dollar gamble with human lives. The pilots could feel the pressure of the high-G maneuvers as they began their defensive break, popping flares and chaff to confuse the incoming Chinese seekers. The smell of sweat and recycled oxygen filled the tight cockpits as the aviators fought to keep their aircraft in the fight while their missiles raced toward the horizon. By 5:45 in the morning, the first phase of the strike was complete. The American missiles were 30 miles from their targets, and the Chinese interceptors were only seconds away from the U.S. formation. The outcome of the next 3 minutes would determine the fate of the carrier air wing and the future of the South China Sea. The battle was no longer a matter of policy. It was a matter of physics and the raw capability of the hardware being hurled through the dawn sky. The silence of the early morning had been replaced by the scream of jet engines and the digital roar of a modern war. 6 in the morning. The EA-18 Gulf Growlers of Electronic Attack Squadron 131 were already pushing their jamming pods to the thermal limit. Their mission was to tear a hole in the Chinese integrated air defense system, a task that had never been attempted against a peer adversary in the digital age. Whether 4 specialized aircraft could drown out the electronic eyes of an entire fleet was the unanswered question that dictated the survival of every pilot in the strike package. Inside the narrow cockpits, the air was cold and dry, smelling of ozone and the faint, hot plastic scent of hard-driven electronics. The screens glowed with a frantic dance of digital ghost targets, while below the jets, the South China Sea was a dark, uncaring void, being raked by invisible beams of high-energy radiation. The electronic warfare officers in the rear seats of the Growlers were the conductors of this silent symphony. They monitored the electromagnetic spectrum at coordinates 16 degrees 30 minutes north, 112 degrees 35 minutes east, where the Chinese HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries were most active. Each Growler carried 5 jamming pods, generating hundreds of kilowatts of focused noise intended to overwhelm the Chinese radar receivers. As the 12 HQ-9 missiles launched in the previous hour closed the distance, the electronic warfare officers initiated a technique known as digital radio frequency memory jamming. They captured the incoming Chinese radar pulses, modified them, and retransmitted them to create hundreds of false aircraft signatures on the enemy screens. The effect was immediate and chaotic for the Chinese defenders. On the displays of the Type 55 destroyers, the clear tracks of the American FA-18 Rhinos suddenly dissolved into a blizzard of electronic snow. The HQ-9 missiles, which had been streaking toward their targets with lethal precision, began to wobble in flight. Their onboard seekers were being flooded with so much white noise that they could no longer distinguish the real metal of a fighter jet from the digital ghosts created by the Growlers. 3 of the missiles lost lock entirely, their internal logic failing as they veered off into the empty sky and self-destructed in twin flashes of orange and white. Contact. Electronic attack is effective, the lead Growler pilot reported over the encrypted data link. The door is open. All shooters. Push, push, push. Despite the success, the workload was immense. The Chinese operators were already attempting to counter the jamming by hopping frequencies across the gigahertz range. The Growlers had to stay within 60 miles of the enemy fleet to maintain the intensity of the noise, placing them well within the engagement envelope of the Chinese long-range defenses. The pilots could feel the constant, low-frequency vibration of the jamming pods through the airframe, a physical manifestation of the massive energy being projected into the atmosphere. While the Growlers held the electronic shield, the F-35 Bravo stealth fighters moved into the gaps created by the interference. The stealth jets used their own advanced sensors to pinpoint the exact locations of the Chinese radar emitters that were still trying to burn through the American jamming. This data was instantly shared with the FA-18 Rhinos, which were now just 80 kilometers from the Chinese vanguard. The American tactics were systematic. The Growlers blinded the enemy, The stealth jets spotted the targets, and the Rhinos provided the heavy firepower to capitalize on the confusion. The Chinese South Sea Fleet attempted to compensate by launching J-15 carrier-based fighters from their own flat tops deeper in the archipelago. However, without clear radar guidance from their surface ships, the Chinese pilots were flying into a digital fog. The airmen knew that at any moment, the silence could be shattered by the launch of a surface-to-air missile. But they trusted the invisible war was being won by the United States Navy in the nanoseconds between radar pulses, long before the first piece of shrapnel ever touched a hull. By 6:15 in the morning, the outer defensive ring of the Chinese blockade was in disarray. The HQ-9 batteries on the Paracel Islands had expended 24 missiles for 0 confirmed hits. The electronic attack squadron had successfully suppressed the most dangerous threats, but the power requirements were beginning to redline the Growlers' cooling systems. The pilots could see the temperature gauges for the jamming pods climbing into the danger zone, a reminder that the electronic shield could not be held forever. The door was open, but it would only stay open for a few more minutes. The stage was now set for the first heavy engagement of the campaign. The long-range anti-ship missiles launched by the Rhinos were entering their terminal phase, dropping even lower to the water to avoid the last-ditch defenses of the Chinese destroyers. The invisible battle of frequencies and logic was about to transition into a visible battle of fire and steel. 70 miles to the east, the USS Ronald Reagan turned once more into the wind, preparing to launch the second wave of the assault. 6:30 in the morning, the airspace 70 miles east of the Paracel Islands. 48 long-range anti-ship missiles were now operating as an autonomous, coordinated pack, skimming just 10 meters above the whitecaps of the South China Sea. This was the saturation phase of the engagement, a tactical maneuver designed to present the Chinese South Sea Fleet with more targets than their computers could process in the final seconds of flight. Whether the sophisticated sensors on the American missiles could outsmart the point defense systems of the Chinese destroyers would decide if the blockade held, or shattered, before the sun fully cleared the horizon. The morning light was a pale, bruised purple, reflecting off the salt-slicked wings of the missiles, as they carved through the humid air at 950 kilometers per hour. The sea below was a chaotic field of gray and white, the surface churned by a steady 15-knot wind that carried the sharp, clean scent of the open ocean into the intake of every turbojet engine. At coordinates 16 degrees 28 minutes north, 112 degrees 40 minutes east, the Chinese vanguard prepared for the impact. The 4 Type 55 destroyers and 6 Type 52 Delta destroyers had formed a tight defensive diamond, maximizing the overlapping fields of fire from their close-in weapon systems. Inside the Chinese combat information centers, the air was thick with the smell of recycled coolant and the static electricity of dozens of high-powered workstations running at maximum capacity. The operators watched as the 48 incoming contacts suddenly changed behavior, spreading out to approach the fleet from multiple different bearings simultaneously. The long-range anti-ship missile was not a dumb weapon. It used its onboard artificial intelligence to identify the highest value targets, ignoring the smaller patrol boats to focus on the massive Type 55 cruisers. The Chinese defenders initiated their final layers of defense. From the vertical launch cells of the destroyers, dozens of HQ-10 short-range surface-to-air missiles launched into the air. These missiles were the Chinese equivalent of the American rolling airframe missile, designed to intercept sea-skimming threats in the last 5 kilometers of their flight. The sky around the Chinese formation became a wall of fire and smoke as the HQ-10 launchers fired, in rapid-fire bursts, sending streaks of white light into the path of the incoming American ordnance. The sound was a continuous, rolling roar that could be heard for miles across the open water, a mechanical scream of steel meeting air. In the final 3 kilometers, the long-range anti-ship missiles began their terminal maneuvers. They did not fly in a straight line. Instead, they performed high G weaving patterns. To defeat the Chinese radar-guided Gatling guns, the Chinese Type 730 close-in weapon systems, capable of firing 10,000 rounds per minute, opened fire, tracer fire stitched across the sky in long, glowing arcs of red and orange, creating a curtain of lead that the American missiles had to punch through. The air was filled with the smell of burnt gunpowder and the acrid smoke of thousands of exploding 30mm shells. Despite the intensity of the Chinese defense, the sheer volume of the American saturation attack began to take its toll. The American missiles used their data links to coordinate their strikes, ensuring that they hit the target ships at the exact same millisecond from opposite sides. This tactic, known as simultaneous time on target, was intended to overwhelm the reaction time of the Chinese automated gun systems. For every American missile that was shot down by a Chinese Gatling gun, another two found a gap in the defensive screen. The tactical situation for the South Sea Fleet was deteriorating rapidly. While their primary radars were still being jammed by the EA-18 Gulf Growlers, the Chinese crews were forced to rely on optical and infrared tracking, which was far less effective against the low observable profile of the American missiles. The commander of the Chinese vanguard ordered all ships to maximum speed, attempting to use maneuvers to complicate the targeting solutions of the incoming weapons. But the long-range anti-ship missiles adjusted their flight paths with cold, mathematical precision. Their infrared seekers locked onto the heat signatures of the Chinese gas turbine exhausts. By 6:45 in the morning, the first missiles had closed to within 1,000 meters of the Chinese hulls. The American strike group, watching from 200 miles away via satellite and drone feeds, saw the defensive fire reach a fever pitch. The screen was no longer just a wall of fire, it was a desperate, last-second struggle for survival. The saturation was complete, and the transition from a long-range missile exchange to a direct kinetic impact was now unavoidable. The South China Sea, once a symbol of territorial ambition, was about to become a graveyard for some of the most advanced warships ever built. 6:50 in the morning, the center of the Chinese defensive diamond. The lead Type 55 destroyer, the Nanchang, was now the primary target of 12 long-range anti-ship missiles closing at Mach 0.9 from 3 different bearings. The electronic brain of each missile finalized its terminal solution, ignoring the decoy flares and chaff clouds to lock onto the massive infrared signature of the cruiser's 4 gas turbine exhaust stacks. This was the moment that would define the effectiveness of American anti-ship doctrine against the most heavily armed surface vessel in the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy. The air around the Nanchang was a this prevent, blinding fog of cordite and gray smoke, while the sea below churned white as the 10,000-ton warship pushed its engines to the absolute breaking point. The smell of hot grease, burnt electronics, and the sharp salt spray of the South China Sea filled the air as the first American warhead crossed the 1,000-meter threshold. The long-range anti-ship missiles executed a sudden, violent pop-up maneuver, climbing 50 meters into the air before diving straight toward the Nanchang's vulnerable upper deck. The Chinese close-in weapon systems screamed in a continuous 10,000 round per minute burst, the red tracers chewing through the air in a desperate attempt to intercept the incoming fire. One American missile was clipped by a 30mm shell, its wing shattering and sending the weapon tumbling into the sea in a spectacular fountain of white water and fire. But the remaining 11 missiles remained on course, their seeker heads cold and calculating as they adjusted their flight paths in the final microseconds of existence. The first 1,000-pound blast fragmentation warhead punched through the thin aluminum skin of the Nanchang's forward superstructure, detonating exactly 0.5 seconds after impact. The explosion was a white-hot hammer that stripped the bridge of its radar arrays and sent a spray of molten metal through the command deck, killing the senior officers instantly. 2 seconds later, a second and third missile drove deep into the ship's midsection, rupturing the fuel lines and igniting the aviation hangar where a Z-9 helicopter was being prepared for flight. The heat of the explosion was so intense that it bleached the sky white for a fraction of a second, casting long, flickering shadows across the waves. The pride of the South Sea Fleet did not go down quietly, but the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. The most devastating blow came when a fourth missile struck the forward Mark 41 equivalent vertical launch system, which still contained over 40 unspent HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles. The impact triggered a massive sympathetic detonation that ripped the forward deck open like a tin can, sending a pillar of orange fire 300 meters into the morning sky. 6 tons of steel plate and internal machinery were hurled into the air, falling back into the sea with the sound of thunder as the hull began to buckle under the internal pressure. Inside the Nanchang, the scene was one of absolute chaos and professional discipline meeting impossible odds. Damage, control teams moved through knee-deep water and choking black smoke, their flash gears scorched and their respirators struggling to filter the chemical bite of burning missile propellant. The ship's internal intercom system had failed, leaving only the sound of rushing water and the roar of the inferno raging in the engine room. Men fought to seal the watertight doors as the destroyer took on a heavy list to port. The deck beneath their feet shuddering with the secondary explosions of small arms ammunition. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the Nanchang was a burning hulk, dead in the water and listing 15 degrees. The remaining 3 Type 55 destroyers in the Vanguard had also sustained hits, though none as fatal as the lead ship. One destroyer had lost its entire aft mast to a missile strike, while another was trailing a thick plume of black smoke as it struggled to maintain steerage. The American saturation attack had successfully decapitated the command and control structure of the Chinese picket line, leaving the remaining vessels fragmented and vulnerable. 200 miles to the east, the Combat Information Center of the USS Ronald Reagan was silent as the satellite imagery updated. The tactical display showed the orange icons of the Chinese Vanguard flickering and then turning gray, signifying they were no longer a combat-effective threat. Confirming 4 heavy surface combatants neutralized or sinking. The tactical action, officer reported, his voice steady. The outer screen is gone. The way to the main body of the South Sea Fleet is now clear. The crew of the Reagan did not cheer. They knew this was only the first 4 hours of W's, a 72-hour campaign, and the Chinese counterstrike was almost certainly already in the air. Black smoke continued to rise from the 7th Nanchang, a funeral pyre visible for 50 miles across the South China Sea. The burning wreckage of the first major engagement hissed as it settled into the waves, the hissing sound of steam, the only noise in the sudden, eerie silence that followed. The missile exchange. The first objective of Operation Coral Shield had been achieved, but the cost in human life on both sides was already beginning to mount. The sea remained gray and indifferent, ready to swallow the remnants of the battle as the sun finally broke through the clouds. 7:30 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Ronald Reagan was a precision-engineered gauntlet of steel, heat, and screaming jet exhaust. The first wave of 48 strike aircraft was returning from the engagement near the Paracels, their fuel states low and their weapon stations empty after the initial saturation attack. This was the most dangerous phase of the 72-hour campaign, where the speed of the logistics pit stop would determine if the United States Navy could maintain its momentum. If the carrier could not recycle its air wing within 90 minutes, the Chinese South Sea Fleet would have the window they needed to regroup and launch a coordinated counterstrike. The air on the deck was a suffocating mix of tropical humidity, vaporized jet fuel, and the scorched metal smell of engines that had been pushed to their thermal limits. A thin layer of salt spray coated every surface, shimmering under the overhead lights as the giant ship carved through the 3-meter swells of the Philippine Sea. The recovery process was a masterpiece of organized chaos, with a tailhook catching the arresting wire every 45 seconds. As each FA-18 Rhino or F-35 Bravo came to a stop, it was immediately swarmed by a pit crew of sailors in color-coded jerseys. The purple shirts or grapes dragged heavy fuel hoses across the non-skid surface, pumping thousands of pounds of high flashpoint jet fuel into the aircraft's internal tanks. Simultaneously, the red shirts of the ordnance teams used manual hoists and specialized carts to move new munitions into position beneath the wings. They worked with a frantic, silent efficiency, bolting 500-pound GBU-32 Joint Direct Attack munitions and AIM-120 missiles onto the pylons. To extend the reach of the strike group without exhausting the manned pilots, the carrier deployed its newest secret weapon, the MQ-25 Stingray. High above the strike group at 20,000 feet, 4 of these unmanned aerial tankers circled in a designated refueling track. The Stingrays allowed the combat air patrol to stay on station for twice as long, providing a persistent shield against any Chinese cruise missiles that might have leaked through the outer defenses. The drones operated autonomously, their software calculating the precise closure rates for the thirsty fighters, while the human operators on the carrier monitored the data links. This invisible bridge of fuel was the lifeblood of the operation, ensuring that the Reagan never had to pull its eyes from the sky to refuel on deck. Deep below the flight deck, in the cavernous bays of the hangar deck, the mechanical reality of war was being addressed with equal intensity. Technicians worked on 2 FA-18 fighters that had sustained minor shrapnel damage from near misses during the first engagement. The smell of hydraulic fluid and ozone filled the workspace as the sailors replaced entire avionics panels and patched composite skin sections with specialized tape and rivets. Every minute an aircraft spent in the hangar was a minute it was not over the target, and the pressure on the maintenance crews was visible in their sweat-soaked uniforms and hollow eyes. They were the unsung engine of the campaign, turning broken machines back into lethal weapons in record time. While the primary focus was on the offensive surge, the somber reality of the medical evacuation protocols was also in motion. On the aft elevator, a CMV-22 Bravo Osprey sat with its massive rotors tilted vertically, its engines humming with a low-frequency thrum that vibrated through the deck. The aircraft was configured for casualty evacuation, ready to transport injured sailors or downed pilots back to the advanced medical facilities at Naval Hospital Guam. The medical team stood by in white jerseys marked with red crosses, their faces grim as they waited for the first reports from the search and rescue helicopters. The professional excellence of the United States military was not just in its ability to destroy, but in its relentless commitment to bringing its people home. By 8:45 in the morning, the transition was nearly complete. The first wave of aircraft had been refueled, rearmed, and inspected for combat readiness, with 44 of the 48 jets cleared for immediate flight. The logistics heartbeat of the carrier had sustained the surge, proving that the American ability to project power was as much about the wrench and the fuel hose as it was about the missile. The carrier strike group was once again ready to strike, its magazines still full and its crew operating with the clockwork precision of a high-performance machine. As the catapults began to hiss with pressurized steam once more, the second phase of the 72-hour war was ready to begin. 9 in the morning. The Philippine Sea, 300 miles east of the Chinese coastline. The USS Ronald Reagan and its escorts were now the focal point of a massive ballistic missile counterstrike. The Chinese South Sea Fleet had failed to stop the American surge, and in response, the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force had launched 16 DF-21 Delta anti-ship ballistic missiles. These carrier killers were currently screaming through the edge of space at Mach 10, their high-speed terminal maneuvers designed to bypass any known defensive system. The sky above the strike group was a deep, artificial blue, the sun high enough to reflect off the polished hulls of the Aegis cruisers that formed the carrier's primary shield. The air was surprisingly still, but beneath the surface of the water, the sonar and radar arrays were vibrating with the electronic energy of a fleet preparing to fight for its life. On the cruiser USS Antietam, designated cruiser CG-54, the AN/SPY-1 Delta radar was operating in high-power discrimination mode. The tactical action officer watched the 16 tracks on his console, each one a diamond-shaped icon descending from an altitude of 100,000 meters. Coordinates 18 degrees 45 minutes north, 116 degrees 10 minutes east, the officer announced, his voice steady despite the terrifying speed of the incoming threats. We have a solid track on all 16 Vampires, engaging with Standard Missile 3. Inside the cruiser's vertical launch system, the solid rocket motors of the Standard Missile 3 interceptors ignited with a bone-shaking roar. 8 missiles erupted from the deck in quick succession, leaving behind thick columns of white smoke that hung in the humid air like the pillars of a temple. The Standard Missile 3 was designed for mid-course interception, traveling beyond the atmosphere to strike the Chinese ballistic missiles while they were still in their ballistic arc. The kinetic kill vehicles separated from the missile boosters, using their own small thrusters to align themselves with the incoming DF-21 Delta warheads. 200 miles above the Earth, the first two intercepts occurred in total silence, the kinetic energy of the collision vaporizing both the interceptor and the target into a cloud of glowing debris. On the bridge of the USS Ronald Reagan, the crew watched the radar displays as 4 of the 16 orange icons blinked out of existence. But 12 missiles remained, and they were now entering their terminal dive, accelerating as they re-entered the denser layers of the atmosphere. The second layer of the Aegis umbrella was the Standard Missile 6, a versatile interceptor capable of engaging targets in the terminal phase of their flight. The cruiser Antietam and the destroyer USS Higgins launched another 24 missiles, creating a wall of interceptors between the carrier and the falling fire. The sky was suddenly filled with the intersecting arcs of white smoke as the Standard Missile 6s reached out to meet the Chinese warheads. The sound of the launches was a continuous, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the hulls of every ship in the strike group. The scent of burnt propellant and the sharp chemical bite of the exhaust was carried across the flight deck by the wind, a reminder of the raw power being expended to keep the carrier afloat. Despite the multi-layered defense, 3 DF-21 Delta missiles managed to leak through the outer and middle screens. These missiles were now just 30 kilometers from the USS Ronald Reagan, their heat shields glowing white-hot as they friction-heated to over 2,000 degrees. The carrier's own self-defense systems, including the evolved Sea Sparrow missile and the rolling airframe missile, initiated their automated firing sequences. The air around the carrier became a storm of white-hot streaks and exploding shells as the close-in weapon systems opened fire at their maximum rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. The deck of the Reagan shuddered under the force of its own defensive fire, the vibration rattling the teeth of the sailors standing in the hangar bays. The final phase of the defense was a matter of seconds. The evolved Sea Sparrow missiles launched from the side of the carrier, intercepting 2 of the remaining Chinese warheads just 5 kilometers from the hull. The explosions were so close that the shock waves washed over the flight deck, knocking over loose equipment and causing the massive ship to heel slightly to starboard. The final DF-21 Delta missile was shredded by the wall of 20mm tungsten rounds from the close-in weapon system, its warhead detonating harmlessly in a massive fireball 200 meters above the water. The fragments of the missile rained down into the sea like a shower of molten iron, hissing as they hit the water and disappeared into the depths. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. For exactly 60 seconds, no one on the bridge of the USS Ronald Reagan spoke as they waited for the radar to confirm that no more threats were inbound. All vampires neutralized, the tactical action officer finally reported, his voice cracking slightly with relief. No damage to the carrier. All escorts remain fully mission capable. The Dragon's breath had been extinguished by the professional excellence of the Aegis crews and the technological superiority of the American defensive umbrella. 72 hours of war had only just begun, but the most dangerous weapon in the Chinese arsenal had been defeated in a single 10-minute engagement. Black smoke continued to rise from the Nanchang, a funeral pyre visible for 50 miles across the South China Sea. The burning wreckage of the first major engagement hissed as it settled into the waves, the hissing sound of steam, the only noise in the sudden, eerie silence that followed the missile exchange. The first objective of Operation Coral Shield had been achieved, but the cost in human life on both sides was already beginning to mount. The sea remained gray and indifferent, ready to swallow the remnants of the battle as the sun finally broke through the clouds. 10:30 in the morning. The edge of the stratosphere, 40,000 feet above the Paracel Islands. The F-35 Bravo were now locked in a high-speed orbital dance with 24 Chinese J-20 stealth fighters. This was the great air battle that would decide the fate of the South Sea Fleet. If the American pilots could not sweep the sky, the carrier would be blind to the movements of the enemy's remaining heavy units. The cockpit of the lead F-35 Bravo was a silent, pressurized sanctuary, the only sound the steady hiss of the oxygen system and the occasional low-frequency growl of the engine. Outside the canopy, the sky was a deep, bruised indigo, while far below, the South China Sea appeared as a vast sheet of wrinkled turquoise glass, dotted with the white smoke trails of burning ships. The air at this altitude was minus 50 degrees, but inside the pilot's flight suit, the sweat of intense concentration was already soaking through his thermal layers. At coordinates 16 degrees, 45 minutes north, 112 degrees, 15 minutes east, the two formations of stealth aircraft closed. At a combined speed of over 3,000 kilometers per hour, the American pilots used their infrared search and track systems to find the heat signatures of the Chinese engines, bypassing the radar-absorbent coatings that made the J-20s invisible to traditional sensors. The tactical data link hummed with the exchange of targeting information, a silent conversation between machines that allowed the American strike package to act as a single, multi-headed organism. Every pilot knew the stakes. The Chinese J-20 was a formidable adversary, faster and more heavily armed than the F/A-18, but lacking the advanced sensor fusion of the F-35. The trigger was squeezed. A single AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missile shrieked off the internal rail of the lead F-35 Bravo, its rocket motor punching a hole through the thin atmosphere with a violent, white-hot flash. The missile accelerated instantly to Mach 4, its solid fuel propellant leaving a razor-thin streak of white smoke that hung in the air for only a heartbeat. The pilot felt the sudden mechanical clunk as the weapon departed the bay, followed by the vibration of the supersonic, airflow smoothing out over the closed doors. The smell of ozone and hot metal from the launch rail seeped into the cockpit, a sharp chemical reminder that the engagement had turned kinetic. The warhead punched straight through the J-20's right engine intake. The 11-pound blast fragmentation charge detonated deep inside the airframe, shredding the titanium turbine blades and turning them into thousands of high-velocity projectiles. The Chinese stealth fighter did not simply catch fire. It erupted instantly into a jagged spray of carbon fiber and burning fuel. The right wing was sheared clean off at the root, sent spinning into the void like a massive, blackened blade, while the fuselage tumbled uncontrollably toward the clouds below. A massive fireball bleached the indigo sky white for 3 seconds, casting a harsh, flickering light across the canopies of the nearby aircraft. The Chinese formation broke in a desperate, high-G scatter. The remaining J-20 pilots slammed their throttles into full afterburner, their twin engines dumping raw fuel into the exhaust to create massive plumes of orange fire. They pulled hard into vertical climbs and barrel rolls, popping dozens of magnesium flares that burned like miniature suns to confuse the American infrared seekers. One Chinese pilot attempted a high angle of attack maneuver, his jet standing on its tail as he tried to bring his nose around for a snapshot, but the maneuver bled so much energy that he became a sitting duck for a following F/A-18. The radio channels were a chaotic overlap of Mandarin warnings and the shrill, rhythmic chirping of radar warning receivers. Black smoke and silver debris from the first kill were still settling through the thin air as the battle moved into its next phase. The sky was now a complex web of white exhaust trails, intersecting and looping in a silent testament to the violence of the struggle. The American formation held its discipline, using their superior situational awareness to pick off the Chinese fighters one by one, as they struggled to regain their tactical cohesion. The Great Air Battle had lasted less than 6 minutes, but in that time, the backbone of the Chinese air defense had been broken. The South China Sea was once again open to the American hammer, and the remaining ships of the South Sea Fleet were now truly alone. 2 in the afternoon on the third day of the campaign. The center of the South China Sea, the Chinese aircraft carrier Shandong was now the final, solitary prize remaining for the carrier air wing of the USS Ronald Reagan. With its escorting destroyers at the bottom of the sea and its air cover decimated, the massive flagship was attempting a desperate retreat toward the naval base at Sanya on Hainan Island. Whether the Shandong could survive the final coordinated strike of 36 American aircraft was no longer a matter of military strategy, but a countdown to an inevitable kinetic conclusion. The tropical sun was a relentless white disk overhead, reflecting off a sea that had turned a deep, bruised purple from the thousands of gallons of spilled oil and debris. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of salt, burnt rubber, and the distant, acrid tang of high explosive residue that still drifted on the humid breeze. At coordinates 17 degrees 10 minutes north, 110 degrees 45 minutes east, the Shandong was struggling to maintain 20 knots. The ship had already sustained minor damage from a previous engagement, and a visible trail of thick black smoke stretched for miles behind it like a funeral shroud. Inside the American cockpits, the pilots of the FA-18 Rhinos and F-35 Bravos could see the target clearly on their long-range infrared sensors. They were now carrying the heaviest ordnance in the carrier's magazine: the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile Extended Range, a weapon designed to penetrate the thickest steel and concrete. The pilots flew in a wide, sweeping arc to approach the carrier from its stern, where its defensive gun systems had the most limited fields of fire. The mission was the final hammer, a systematic dismantling of the last symbol of Chinese maritime power in the region. The American strike leader, flying an FA-18 Rhino, checked his master arm switch and synchronized the timing with the rest of the squadron. All hammer units, this is lead. Execute terminal phase on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Weapons free. 24 heavy cruise missiles dropped from the wings of the American jets, their small turbojet engines spooling up to a high-pitched whine that could be felt through the airframes. The missiles dropped low, hugging the surface of the water just 5 meters above the waves, disappearing into the radar clutter as they accelerated to 900 kilometers per hour. The trigger was squeezed. On the lead FA-18, the pilot watched the data link confirm the release of the final 2 missiles. The weapons shrieked away from the aircraft, 2 columns of white fire and gray smoke punching backward into the thin air with a physical jolt that shook the pilot's seat. The heat blast from the missile motors washed across the underside of the jet, the temperature momentarily spiking to 1,000 degrees before the weapons vanished toward the horizon. The smell of burning propellant filled the cockpit for a fraction of a second, a sharp, chemical bite that signaled the beginning of the end for the Chinese carrier. The first warhead punched clean through the Shandong's flight deck armor. The 1,000-pound hardened penetrator drove 6 meters deep into the ship's internal structure before detonating in the center of the main hangar bay. The explosion was a titanic roar that buckled the steel deck plates from the inside out, sending a massive geyser of orange flame and shredded aircraft parts 200 meters into the air. 3 more missiles followed in rapid succession, striking the ship's island superstructure and the aft elevator, effectively turning the carrier into a drifting, burning wreck. A fireball of vaporized jet fuel and hydraulic fluid erupted from the midsection, bleaching the sky white and casting a blinding glare across the surrounding water for 5 full seconds. The Chinese crew reacted with a desperate, frantic bravery. Damage control teams rushed toward the inferno, their silver heat-reflective suits shimmering against the wall of fire that was now consuming the rear half of the ship. The remaining close-in weapon systems on the starboard side continued to fire blindly into the sky, their barrels glowing cherry red as they expended their final belts of ammunition into the day. Empty air. In a final act of defiance, the ship's captain ordered a hard turn to port to wash the flames away from the primary magazine. But the hull was already taking on thousands of tons of water through the jagged holes at the waterline. The carrier began to heel over, the deck tilting at a steep 15-degree angle that sent unchained equipment and burning wreckage sliding into the sea. The immediate aftermath was a scene of catastrophic silence, punctuated by the sound of metal groaning under impossible stress. Black smoke boiled from the Shandong, rising in a solid pillar that could be seen from the coast of Vietnam, 60 miles away. The sea around the carrier was a churning graveyard of white foam and orange life rafts, while the massive ship itself continued to list further. To port, its engines finally falling silent as the cold Pacific water flooded the main boiler rooms. The final hammer had fallen with absolute precision, and the pride of the South Sea Fleet was now just a collection of sinking steel and fading echoes on the radar. Black smoke continued to rise from the Shandong, a funeral pyre visible for 50 miles across the South China Sea. The burning wreckage of the first major engagement hissed as it settled into the waves, the hissing sound of steam the only noise. In the sudden, eerie silence that followed the missile exchange, the first objective of Operation Coral Shield had been achieved, but the cost in human life on both sides was already beginning to mount. The sea remained gray and indifferent, ready to swallow the remnants of the battle as the sun finally broke through the clouds. 4 in the morning on the 4th day, the South China Sea, 72 hours after the first catapult launch from the USS Ronald Reagan. The sea was a flat, featureless sheet of dark glass under a moonless sky, showing no outward sign of the thousands of tons of steel that had settled into the deep trenches over the previous 3 days. Operation Coral Shield had concluded with the systematic neutralization of the People's Liberation Army, Navy's South Sea Fleet, a feat of arms that had fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. In less time than it takes for a storm to cross the coast, the unanswered question of whether a single carrier strike group could dismantle a modern, integrated fleet had been answered with a finality that would be studied in military academies for the next 50 years. The air was cool and carried only the clean, sharp smell of the open ocean, the acrid stink of burning propellant and jet fuel, having finally been washed away by the steady western trade winds. On the flag bridge of Carrier Strike Group 5, the tactical displays were no longer crowded with orange icons or blinking missile warnings. Instead, the screens showed the blue tracks of friendly search and rescue aircraft, and the steady, rhythmic sweep of the ANSPY-6 radar looking for targets that no longer existed. The commanding officer stood at the central plotting table, reviewing the final after-action report with the clinical detachment of a professional auditor. At coordinates 17 degrees, 12 minutes north, 110 degrees, 48 minutes east. The last sonar pings had confirmed the Shandong had slipped beneath the waves, resting at a Reister depth of over 3,000 meters. The blockade of the Paracel Islands was not just broken. The force required to maintain it had been erased from the digital order of battle. The statistical assessment of the 72-hour campaign was staggering in its efficiency and its lethality. The Chinese South Sea Fleet had lost 1 aircraft carrier, 4 Type 55 destroyers, 6 Type 52 Delta destroyers, and 12 smaller frigates and corvettes. In the air, 182 Chinese aircraft, including 34 J-20 stealth fighters, had been confirmed destroyed in air-to-air combat or by surface-to-air missiles. The strategic objective of clearing the South China Sea of hostile surface threats had been achieved with a speed that left regional geopolitical landscape in a state of absolute shock. For the first time in decades, the shipping lanes from the Strait of Malacca to the Philippine Sea were open without the shadow of a hovering blockade. The cost to the United States Navy, while light in comparison to the enemy's losses, was acknowledged with somber honesty. Carrier Strike Group 5 had lost 4 FA-18 Rhinos, 2 F-35 Bravo stealth fighters, and 1 MH-60 Sierra helicopter. 18 American personnel had been killed in action, most during the initial high-intensity ballistic missile counterstrike on First 4, the second day. 3 of the escorting destroyers had sustained minor shrapnel damage and radar array failures, but the strike group remained fully mission-capable. The deck of the Reagan, though scorched and worn from the high-tempo operations, was still a functioning airfield, a testament to the endurance of the sailors and the machines they maintained. Logistics remained the final piece of the post-campaign analysis. In 72 hours, the carrier had expended over 500 precision-guided munitions and 2 million gallons of jet fuel. The supply ships of the Combat Logistics Force were already moving. into position to execute a massive underway replenishment, their holds filled with the 1,000-pound bombs and AIM-120 missiles needed to reset the magazines. The heartbeat of the Navy was already preparing for the next potential phase, even as the current one drew to a close. There was no celebration on the flight deck, only the steady, quiet work of cleaning the non-skid surface and checking the tension on the catapult wires. By 6 in the morning, the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and deep orange. The USS Ronald Reagan turned into the wind one final time to recover the last combat air patrol of the operation. The shadow of the carrier's island fell long across the deck, a dark finger pointing toward the west where the remnants of the Chinese fleet once stood. The 72-hour war was over, but the professional vigilance of the 7th Fleet remained. The South China Sea was silent, the only sound, the white wake of the carrier as it moved toward its next station, leaving behind a graveyard of ambition and the cold, blue depths of the Pacific.